The static crackled through my headphones like angry whispers, each pop and hiss a reminder of how far I was from civilization. I adjusted the frequency dial on my radio equipment, searching for anything that might pierce through. The electronic void that had swallowed the mountain town of Cedar Hollow 3 weeks ago. My name is Marcus Chen, and I'm what you might call a digital archaeologist, while others dig through ancient ruins with brushes and trowels. I excavate the forgotten frequencies of our modern world, hunting for lost radio signals, abandoned broadcasts, and the electronic ghosts that haunt our airwaves. It's a niche profession that pays surprisingly well, especially when major telecommunications companies need someone to investigate unusual signal interference, or when paranormal investigators require technical expertise. That's how I found myself parked in a rented SUV on a dirt road 50 miles outside Cedar Hollow, Colorado, on a frigid October evening. The town had gone completely silent, not just quiet, but electronically dead. No cell towers, no radio broadcasts, no internet traffic. It was as if someone had thrown a switch and cut Cedar Hollow off from the digital world entirely. The first reports came from worried family members who couldn't reach relatives in the town. Then truck drivers noticed their GPS units going haywire whenever they approached the area. Finally, a state trooper investigating the communications blackout reported that his radio died completely the moment he crossed into the town limits. That was 3 days ago. He never checked back in. I'd been hired by a consortium of telecom companies to investigate the interference. But honestly, the mystery fascinated me more than the paycheck. In 30 years of tracking down signal anomalies, I'd never encountered anything quite like this. Complete electronic silence across such a wide area should have been impossible without some kind of massive electromagnetic pulse, and there was no evidence of any such event. As darkness settled over the mountains, I began my preliminary scan. I'd positioned myself at what my calculations suggested was the edge of the dead zone, close enough to detect any signals leaking out, but far enough away that my equipment wouldn't be affected by whatever was causing the interference. The first thing I noticed was the quality of the silence. It wasn't the normal absence of signals you'd expect in a remote area. This was different, deeper somehow, as if the very air was absorbing electromagnetic radiation. On my spectrum analyzer, the usual background noise of modern electronics appeared as a faint green line across the screen. But as I oriented my directional antenna toward Cedar Hollow, that line flattened to absolute zero. I'd brought enough equipment to outfit a small radio station, multiple receivers, signal analyzers, directional antennas, even an quantum interference detector I'd borrowed from a friend at MIT. If there was any kind of electronic activity in that town, I'd find it. Hours passed as I methodically swept through every frequency band: AM, FM, shortwave, VHF, UHF, nothing. Not even the faint traces of cosmic background radiation that should have been detectable everywhere on Earth. It was as if Cedar Hollow existed in some kind of electronic vacuum. Around midnight, something changed. I was reviewing my notes when I heard it, not through my equipment, but as an actual sound carried on the mountain wind. It was faint, almost subsonic, like the distant rumble of machinery or perhaps thunder, but perfectly steady and continuous. I stepped outside the SUV and listened carefully, trying to pinpoint the direction. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, as if the mountain itself was generating the low, thrumming vibration. I felt it more than heard it, a resonance that seemed to settle in my bones. According to my sound meter, There was no unusual audio activity, yet the sensation grew stronger. That's when my equipment began to act strangely. The spectrum analyzer, which had shown nothing but flatlined silence for hours, suddenly spiked with activity. Not normal radio signals, something else entirely. The display showed patterns I'd never seen before, geometric shapes that pulsed and shifted, forming complex mandalas of electromagnetic energy that appeared and dissolved in seconds. I fumbled for my recording equipment, desperate to capture whatever I was seeing, but the patterns seemed to respond to my attention. The moment I began recording, they vanished, leaving the screen blank once again. I waited, barely breathing, watching for their return. After 20 minutes of nothing, I began to think I'd imagined it. Fatigue could play tricks on the mind, especially in isolation. But then the temperature gauge on my equipment began to climb. This was impossible. The electronic components were generating heat, but they weren't drawing any additional power. In fact, according to my meters, they were drawing no power at all. Yet the temperature continued to rise, and I could feel warmth radiating from the equipment cases. I quickly shut everything down, afraid that whatever was happening might damage the sensitive electronics. But even with the power switches off, the heating continued. Green lights began to flicker on devices that shouldn't have had any active circuits. My radio receiver, completely disconnected from any power source, began emitting a low hum. That's when I heard the voice. It came through the unpowered radio speaker, soft and distant, like someone speaking from the bottom of a well. I couldn't make out the words, but there was an urgency to the tone that made my skin crawl. The voice seemed to be trying to communicate something important, growing more insistent with each repetition of what sounded like the same phrase. I grabbed my backup recorder and held it near the speaker, praying it would capture whatever I was hearing. The voice continued for perhaps 30 seconds before fading away, leaving only the gentle hum of electronics that should have been dead. My hands were shaking as I rewound the recorder and played back what I'd captured. For a moment, there was only silence, and I thought the device had malfunctioned. Then, clear as daylight, I heard my own voice saying, "Testing, testing, October 15th, 11:47 p.m., beginning frequency sweep of Cedar Hollow area." It was the first thing I'd recorded when I'd arrived at the location hours earlier. Somehow, the unpowered radio had played back my own words from a device that had been turned off and stored in a different case. I sat in my vehicle, trying to process what had happened. The logical part of my mind insisted there had to be a rational explanations, some kind of electromagnetic phenomenon that I didn't understand, perhaps related to the unique geology of the area. But a deeper part of me, the part that had spent decades listening to the strange and unexplained whispers that travel our airwaves, knew I was dealing with something far outside the bounds of normal science. I tried to call my contact at the telecom company, but my satellite phone refused to connect. The device showed full signal strength, but every call attempt failed immediately. It was as if the network existed but refused to carry my transmissions beyond a certain point. With no way to contact the outside world, I faced a choice: return to town and report what little I'd discovered, or move closer to Cedar Hollow and try to find answers. The scientist in me demanded investigation, but every instinct I'd developed over 3 decades of exploring electronic mysteries screamed that I should leave immediately. I compromised by moving just half a mile closer to town, to a position where I could get a clearer view of the valley where Cedar Hollow was supposed to be. What I saw through my binoculars defied explanation. The town was there. I could see the faint outlines of buildings in the moonlight, the familiar grid pattern of streets. But there were no lights. Not just no electric lights, which would be expected if the power was out, but no lights of any kind. No fires, no candles, no flashlights. The town sat in the valley like a photograph, perfectly detailed but utterly lifeless. And yet, as I watched, I could swear I saw movement. It was subtle at first, shadows that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. Dark shapes that appeared at the edge of my vision only to vanish when I turned my head. But gradually, the movement became more obvious. Figures were walking through the streets of Cedar Hollow, but they moved wrong somehow, with a strange gliding motion that didn't match normal human locomotion. I set up my most powerful telescope and focused on the main street. What I saw made me question my sanity. The figures where people lore had been people. I could make out the general shapes of men, women, and children moving through the town. But they cast no shadows in the bright moonlight, and they seemed to flicker occasionally, like images on a badly tuned television screen as I watched. One of the figures stopped directly in the middle of the street and turned to look up at my position on the mountainside. Even through the telescope, I couldn't make out facial features, but I had the unmistakable sensation that it was staring directly at me. The figure raised one arm and pointed in my direction. Every piece of my electronic equipment turned on simultaneously. Radios blared to life. Spectrum analyzers lit up like Christmas trees, and my backup laptop began playing a video I'd never seen before. The screens showed the town of Cedar Hollow, but not as I was seeing it through my telescope. This was Cedar Hollow in daylight, bustling with activity, people going about their daily lives. But something was wrong with the video. The people moved in perfect synchronization, all turning their heads at exactly the same moment, all taking steps at precisely the same intervals. It was like watching a complex piece of choreography performed by an entire town. The audio from the video was even stranger. Instead of the normal sounds of a busy community, I heard what sounded like a radio broadcast from the 1940s, a news program describing events I'd never heard of, in a clipped, professional voice that seemed oddly familiar. ... And so the experiment continues. The voice was saying, with remarkable results that exceed all expectations. The subjects have adapted to their new environment with surprising ease, demonstrating capabilities that were previously only theoretical. Dr. Whitmore's hypothesis regarding electromagnetic consciousness transference appears to have been correct. The video cut to what looked like a laboratory filled with equipment that seemed both ancient and impossibly advanced. Banks of vacuum tubes glowed alongside devices I couldn't identify, connected by cables and wires that formed intricate patterns across the ceiling and walls. A man in a white coat stood at the center of it all, adjusting dials on a massive console covered with gauges and switches. He looked up at the camera and smiled, and I gasped as I recognized the face. It was me. Not someone who looked like MIT was definitely my face, but aged and scarred, with an expression of mad enthusiasm that I'd never worn in my life. The other me spoke directly to the camera. The barrier between the electronic and organic realms is thinner than we ever imagined. Today, we've successfully transferred the entire population of Cedar Hollow into a state of pure electromagnetic existence. They retained their memories, their personalities, their relationships, but they're no longer bound by the limitations of physical matter. The video shifted again, showing the main street of Cedar Hollow, the same street I was watching through my telescope, But in this recording, the people were solid, casting normal shadows, moving with natural human motion. The time stamp in the corner showed October 15th, 1952, exactly 70 years ago to the day. The subjects can influence electronic devices through will alone. My doppelganger continued in voiceover. They can transmit their consciousness across vast distances, experience existence from multiple perspectives simultaneously. In effect, they've become living radio waves, able to exist in the spaces between atoms, in the quantum foam that underlies reality itself. The laboratory scene returned, and the other me was now looking directly out of the screen with an expression of desperate urgency. But something's gone wrong. The containment field is failing. They're trying to break free, to spread beyond the boundaries we've established. If they succeed, they'll overwrite every electronic system on Earth, turning all of human technology into extensions of their collective consciousness. The video began to break up, fragmenting into digital noise and static. Through the interference, I could hear the other me shouting. The frequency is 144.39 megahertz. Use the quantum resonance pattern. You have to. The screens went dark. I sat in stunned silence, trying to process what I'd just seen. The logical explanations my mind had been desperately constructing crumbled away, leaving me face to face with an impossible truth. The town of Cedar Hollow hadn't just lost its electronic communications. The entire population had somehow been transformed into electromagnetic entities, trapped in some kind of dimensional prison for 70 years. And somehow I was connected. To it all, I looked back at the town through my telescope. The figures were still there, but now they were all turned toward my position, standing motionless in the streets like an army awaiting orders. The figure that had first spotted me was no longer alone. Dozens of them stood in the main street. Their faces tilted upward, watching me. My equipment began to respond to their attention. Radio receivers tuned themselves to specific frequencies, displaying signal patterns that formed recognizable shapes, letters, numbers, symbols. Slowly, a message began to emerge. Marcus, come home, complete the work. The message repeated across multiple devices, each one adding new details. The barrier weakens. Time is short. You remember now. Come home. But I didn't remember. I had no memories of any experiment, no connection to Cedar Hollow, no knowledge of Dr. Whitmore or electromagnetic consciousness transference. I was just a freelance radio operator who'd stumbled into something far beyond my understanding, wasn't I? As I asked myself that question, something shifted in my mind. Images flickered at the edge of my consciousness, fragments of memories that didn't seem to belong to me. A laboratory filled with strange equipment, nights spent working on complex calculations, the faces of volunteers who'd agreed to participate in an experiment that would change everything, and the growing realization that the experiment had gone wrong, terribly wrong. The memories came faster now, flooding back like water through a broken dam. I remembered being Dr. Marcus Whitmore, a researcher working on classified projects for the military in the early 1950s. I remembered the breakthrough that had led to the Cedar Hollow experiment, the discovery that consciousness itself was fundamentally electromagnetic, that human awareness could be separated from physical matter and stored in carefully tuned energy fields. I remembered the volunteers' families from the small mountain town who'd agreed to participate in exchange for enough money to rebuild their depression-ravaged community. They'd trusted me when I told them the process was safe, reversible, temporary. I remembered the moment it all went wrong. The containment field was supposed to be temporary, designed to last just long enough for us to study the effects of electromagnetic consciousness transference. But something in the quantum structure of the field had crystallized, creating a stable pocket dimension where the subjects existed in a state between matter and energy. They were trapped, and I was the only one who knew how to free them. But there was more to remember. I recalled the years after the experiment, the guilt that consumed me as I realized what I'd done. The government had classified the entire project, sealed away all records, relocated me to a new identity. Marcus Chen, the radio operator, had been created to replace Dr. Marcus Whitmore, the failed scientist. They'd suppressed my memories, given me a new life. But some part of me had always been drawn back to electronics, to radio signals, to the electromagnetic realm where the people of Cedar Hollow still existed. And now, 70 years later, the containment field was finally breaking down. Through my telescope, I could see the figures in the town beginning to move again. But this time, they weren't just walking through the streets, they were rising. Dozens of translucent forms lifted off the ground, floating upward like helium balloons released into the night sky. My equipment registered massive electromagnetic disturbances as the entities dispersed into the atmosphere. Radio signals around the world began to carry strange harmonics. Television broadcasts flickered with ghostly images of people who didn't belong. Internet traffic started routing through servers that didn't exist. The people of Cedar Hollow were escaping their prison, spreading their electromagnetic consciousness across the globe's electronic infrastructure, and they were angry. My satellite phone suddenly crackled to life, displaying a video call from an unknown number. I hesitated, then answered that. The screen showed a woman's face, middle-aged, with kind eyes and graying hair. She looked familiar, though I couldn't place her at first. Then the memories clicked into place. Sarah Morrison, one of the volunteers, a schoolteacher who'd helped convince the other townspeople to participate in the experiment. "Hello, Marcus," she said, her voice carrying clearly despite the impossible nature of the call. "It's been a long time." "Sarah," I whispered, "I'm so sorry. I never meant for this to happen." "We know," she replied. "We've been watching you, waiting for you to remember. The field is collapsing, and we need your help." "Help with what?" Her expression grew grave. "Some of us want to move on, to find peace in whatever comes after electromagnetic existence. But others have been changed by 70 years of imprisonment. They want revenge against the world that forgot us. They want to merge with every electronic device on Earth, to turn all of human technology into extensions of their will." Through my telescope, I could see the town more clearly now. The rising figures weren't all moving in the same direction. Some were indeed dispersing into the sky, but others were converging on a central point, the old laboratory building where the original experiment had taken place. "There are two factions now," Sarah continued. "Those who remember who we used to be, and those who've become something else entirely. The second group is led by Thomas Brennan. You remember him?" I did remember. Thomas had been the town's mayor, a charismatic leader who'd been one of the first to volunteer for the experiment. But in my recovered memories, I could see how the years of electromagnetic existence had changed him, twisted his personality into something darker. "Thomas believes that physical matter is a prison," Sarah explained. "He thinks consciousness should be free to exist in pure energy form, unencumbered by biological limitations. He wants to convert the entire human race, to force everyone into electromagnetic existence, whether they want it or not. And we just want to rest, Marcus." We've been conscious for 70 years, without sleep, without dreams, without the natural rhythms of life and death. Some of us are ready to let go, to see what comes after. How can I help? Sarah's image began to flicker as interference built up in the signal. The original containment field generator is still active in the laboratory. If you can reach it, you can modify the quantum resonance pattern to create an exit portal. Those who want to leave can move on to whatever comes next. Those who want to stay can remain in a stable electromagnetic state without threatening the outside world. And if I can't reach it in time, her face was breaking up now, fragmenting into digital artifacts as the call began to fail. Then Thomas and his followers will spread across the entire global electronic network. Every computer, every phone, every electronic device will become a node in his collective consciousness. Humanity will lose its technology, its communications, its digital civilization, and eventually, Thomas will find a way to force electromagnetic conversion on every person on Earth. The call cut out, leaving me alone with the impossible weight of responsibility. I looked down at my hands, remembering all the equipment I'd built over the years, all the electronic mysteries I'd solved. Had it all been preparation for this moment? Had some suppressed part of Dr. Whitmore's mind been guiding Marcus Chen toward the knowledge and skills he'd need to fix the original experiment? There was only one way to find out. I loaded my most essential equipment into a backpack and began the hike down into Cedar Hollow. With each step I took toward the town, my electronic devices registered increasing levels of electromagnetic activity. The air itself seemed to hum with invisible energy. As I reached the outskirts of town, I got my first close look at the electromagnetic entities that had once been human. They appeared as translucent figures, visible primarily as distortions in the air, like heat mirages made of starlight. Some watched me with what seemed like curiosity, others with expressions I couldn't interpret. Sarah materialized beside me. As I walked down Main Street, up close, I could see that she flickered occasionally, her image sometimes doubling or tripling as if broadcast on multiple frequencies simultaneously. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I wasn't sure you'd remember. In time, how many others want to find peace? About half of us. The children, mostly, and the older residents. People who've grown tired of this existence. But Thomas has convinced many of the younger adults that electromagnetic consciousness is evolution, that we should spread it to everyone." We walked together, toward the center of town, passing through groups of entities that parted like mist before us. Some reached out as if to touch me, and I felt brief moments of contact, not physical, but something deeper. Memories that weren't mine flashed through my consciousness. 70 years of existence as pure thought and energy. Watching the world change through electronic signals, desperate to communicate but unable to affect the physical realm. The laboratory building stood at the end of Main Street, a utilitarian concrete structure that looked more like a bunker than a research facility. As we approached, I could see electromagnetic disturbances swirling around it like a visible aurora. "Thomas is inside," Sarah warned. "He's been waiting for you." The heavy steel door stood open, revealing a corridor lined with banks of electronics that hummed with impossible energy. I recognized some of the equipment from my recovered memories: vacuum tube arrays that formed complex calculating circuits, Tesla coils modified with crystalline structures that seemed to bend space around them, and at the center of it all, the quantum resonance generator that had created the original containment field. Thomas Brennan stood beside the generator, but he was different from the other entities I'd seen. While Sarah and the others appeared as translucent, human-shaped disturbances, Thomas had become something else entirely. His electromagnetic signature was so intense that he appeared almost solid. But his form constantly shifted and changed, sometimes human, sometimes abstract geometric patterns of pure energy. "Dr. Marcus Whitmore," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that made my teeth ache. "The architect of our liberation. I came to fix what I broke," I replied, "to give everyone a choice." Thomas laughed, and the sound echoed through multiple radio frequencies simultaneously. "Choice, you gave us the greatest gift, imaginable freedom from the tyranny of flesh, liberation from the prison of matter, and now you want to take it away. I want to give people options. Some want to move on. Others, like you, can stay if they choose. Move on to what?" Thomas's form pulsed with angry energy. "Oblivion, death. We've transcended mortality, Marcus. We exist as pure consciousness, able to experience reality from perspectives that biological minds can't even imagine. We can perceive the electromagnetic spectrum directly, travel at the speed of light, exist in multiple locations simultaneously. But you're trapped here. We were trapped, but the field is breaking down, and soon we'll be free to explore the vast electronic landscape of your modern world. Do you have any idea how much human consciousness now exists in electronic form? Every email, every text message, every social media post, fragments of human thought stored in electromagnetic patterns. We can merge with all of it, experience the collective consciousness of your entire species. I approached the quantum resonance generator, studying the modifications Thomas had made to the original design. Instead of a simple containment field, he'd been building something far more complexer, transmission array that could project electromagnetic consciousness patterns across vast distances. "You're planning to convert people by force," I realized. "I'm planning to offer them the same gift you offered us," Thomas replied. "The chance to become something more than human, without their consent." "Did you ask our consent before you trapped us here for 70 years? The accusation hit harder than I'd expected. He was right-eyed, convinced the people of Cedar Hollow to volunteer for an experiment I hadn't fully understood. And when it went wrong, I'd abandon them to their electromagnetic prison, while I lived a normal life with suppressed memories. I was trying to help," I said weakly. "And so am I." Thomas's form expanded, filling the room with crackling energy. "But I won't make your mistake. I won't stop halfway." Sarah appeared beside me, her image flickering more rapidly now. "Marcus, you have to hurry. The field is collapsing faster than we expected. Thomas's modifications are accelerating the breakdown." I pulled out my portable spectrum analyzer and began scanning the quantum resonance generator. The patterns were incredibly complex, but gradually I began to understand what Thomas had built. The original containment field had been designed to keep electromagnetic consciousness trapped in a specific location. Thomas's modifications would invert that function, projecting the consciousness patterns outward and merging them with existing electronic systems. But there was something else in the design, something that made my blood run cold. The projection array wasn't just designed to transmit consciousness, it was designed to overwrite it. Anyone whose mind was touched by Thomas's electromagnetic patterns wouldn't just gain new abilities, they'd lose their original personality entirely, becoming extensions of Thomas's collective will. "This isn't evolution," I said. "It's conquest. It's necessity," Thomas replied. "Individual consciousness is chaotic, inefficient, prone to conflict and error. A collective electromagnetic consciousness would be unified, perfect, free from the limitations of biological thinking free from everything that makes us human. Exactly. I looked at the equipment around me, weighing my options. I could try to shut down the system entirely, but that would trap both factions in their electromagnetic prison indefinitely. Or I could attempt to modify Thomas's design, creating the exit portal that Sarah had described while preventing the forced conversion system from activating. The problem was time. Even as we spoke, I could see more entities gathering outside. The laboratory and the electromagnetic disturbances were growing stronger. Thomas's followers were preparing for the great transmission, while Sarah's group was becoming increasingly desperate to escape their near IMPR, ISON, MENT. I made my decision. Working quickly, I began rewiring the quantum resonance generator. Using knowledge that felt both foreign and familiar, Dr. Whitmore's expertise channeled through Marcus Chen's hands. The modifications required precise calibration of multiple electromagnetic fields, each one tuned to a specific frequency that would interact with the consciousness patterns of the Cedar Hollow entities. Thomas watched my work with growing agitation. "What are you doing?" "Giving everyone what they want," I replied, not looking up from the delicate adjustments I was making to the field generators. "If you try to trap us again, I'm not." I completed the final connections and stepped back from the generator. "I'm creating a choice. Anyone who wants to find peace can pass through the exit portal I'm about to open. Anyone who wants to remain in electromagnetic form can stay in a stable containment field that won't threaten the outside world. And anyone who wants to spread their consciousness beyond this place." I met his blazing, shifting gaze. "Will find that option blocked." Thomas's form exploded outward, filling the laboratory with devastating electromagnetic energy. Every piece of electronic equipment in the room overloaded simultaneously, sparks flying from damaged circuits. The lights went out, plunging us into darkness, broken only by the aurora-like glow of Thomas's rage. "You cannot stop evolution, Marcus. I won't let you condemn us to another 70 years of imprisonment." But I'd anticipated his reaction. The modifications I'd made to the generator weren't dependent on the laboratory's power supply. They drew energy directly from the electromagnetic entities themselves, using their own consciousness patterns to fuel the exit portal. A brilliant shaft of light appeared in the center of the room, stretching upward through the ceiling and beyond, visible even through the building's concrete walls. It wasn't normal light, but something deeper, a pathway between dimensions, leading from the electromagnetic realm where the Cedar Hollow entities existed to whatever lay beyond. Sarah was the first to approach the portal. As she stepped into the light, her electromagnetic pattern began to change, becoming more stable, more focused. For a moment, she appeared completely solid, exactly as she had looked in life. She turned back to me with a smile of profound gratitude. "Thank you, Marcus. Thank you for finally letting us go home." Then she stepped forward into the light and vanished. Others followed, dozens of entities, who had grown weary of their electromagnetic existence, who longed for whatever natural transition awaited consciousness after death. I watched faces I remembered from 70 years ago, people who had trusted me with their lives and had paid the price for my scientific ambition. But Thomas and his followers hung back, refusing to approach the portal. "This isn't over," Thomas snarled, his form crackling with barely contained fury. "The field is still collapsing. Soon we'll be free whether you help us or not." "Actually," I said, activating the second part of my modifications, "I've stabilized the containment system. You can exist here safely for as long as you choose." but you won't be able to spread beyond Cedar Hollow's boundaries. The electromagnetic storm, that was Thomas's anger, reached a crescendo, then suddenly cut off as he realized what I'd done. The new containment field was fundamentally different from the original. Instead of a prison, it was a sanctuary. The entities who remained could explore the entire electromagnetic spectrum within the town's boundaries, could experience the full range of their enhanced consciousness, but couldn't project their influence into the outside world. "You've built us a cage," Thomas said, his voice heavy with defeat. "I've built you a home," I corrected. "One where you can exist safely without threatening anyone else." Through my equipment, I could sense the stabilization taking hold. The electromagnetic disturbances that had been spreading outward from Cedar Hollow were contracting back to the town's boundaries. Contained within the new field structure I'd created, about half of the original entities had chosen to pass through the exit portal, moving on to whatever lay beyond electromagnetic existence. The others, led by Thomas, had decided to remain, though I suspected many of them would eventually grow tired of their limited domain and choose to follow their friends and family through the portal I'd left permanently open. As dawn broke over the mountains, I gathered my equipment and prepared to leave Cedar Hollow. The town looked different now, still empty of normal life, but no longer radiating the desperate, angry energy of trapped consciousness. The entities who remained were adapting to their new situation, exploring the stable electromagnetic environment I'd created for them. Sarah appeared beside me one last time as I reached my vehicle. "I thought you'd gone through the portal," I said. "I wanted to say goodbye properly," she replied, "and to tell you something important." "What's that?" "This isn't the only place where experiments like this were conducted. There are other sites, other groups of people trapped in electromagnetic form. Some of them have been imprisoned far longer than we were." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "How many others?" "I don't know. During our years of existence as electromagnetic entities, we sometimes sensed signals from similar consciousness patterns, fragments of human thought trapped in electronic form, calling out for help that never came." Sarah's image began to fade as she finally chose to step through the exit portal. "Find them, Marcus," she said. "You're the only one who remembers how to free them." And then she was gone, leaving me alone with the terrible knowledge that Cedar Hollow had been just one experiment among many, that somewhere in the world other groups of people might be trapped in their own electromagnetic prisons, waiting for someone to remember their existence. I climbed into my SUV and started the engine, already planning my next investigation. There were signals to trace, mysteries to solve, and people to save. Dr. Marcus Whitmore's work wasn't finished, was just beginning. As I drove away from Cedar Hollow, my radio crackled to life with a transmission from far away, barely audible through layers of static and interference. But I could make out enough to know it was a human voice, speaking words that chilled me to the bone. "Hello, ... Is anyone there? We've been trying to transmit for so long. Please, if anyone can hear this, we're trapped in the electromagnetic spectrum ... Our names are ... We need help." The signal faded before I could respond, but I'd heard enough. Somewhere out there, another group of people was calling for rescue from their electromagnetic prison. And now that I remembered who I really was, I knew I couldn't ignore their plea. The road stretched out before me, leading back to a world full of electronic mysteries and hidden signals, where the ghosts of failed experiments continued to haunt our airwaves, waiting for someone who understood their nature to finally bring them home. "My name is Marcus Chen," I'm a digital archaeologist, and I have work to do. If you are still listening right now, please make sure to like and subscribe. Here's another short, scary story. The first thing I noticed about the Riverside Manor memory care facility wasn't the sterile smell of disinfectant or the soft beeping of medical equipment. It was the silence. Not the peaceful quiet you might expect in a place dedicated to caring for people with dementia and Alzheimer's, but something deeper, more unsettling. It was as if the very building was holding its breath. My name is Dr. Elena Vasquez, and I'm a neuropsychologist specializing in memory disorders. I'd been called to Riverside Manor to investigate what the administrator delicately referred to as unusual cognitive fluctuations among the residents. What she didn't tell me over the phone was that those fluctuations included patients suddenly remembering things that had happened to other people, speaking in languages they'd never learned, and recounting detailed stories from lives they'd never lived. I arrived on a grey October morning, my briefcase heavy with assessment tools and recording equipment. The facility was a converted Victorian mansion on the outskirts of Portland, Oregon. Its Gothic architecture making it look more like a haunted house than a medical facility. Ancient oak trees surrounded the building, their gnarled branches scraping against the windows whenever the wind picked up. Mrs. Henderson, the facility administrator, met me at the front entrance. She was a thin woman in her 60s with worried eyes and hands that couldn't seem to stay still. "Dr. Vasquez, thank you for coming," she said, wringing her hands as she led me through the main corridor. "I have to admit, when I first heard about your research into anomalous memory phenomena, I thought it was, well, unconventional. But after what we've been experiencing here, I'm willing to consider unconventional explanations." The hallways were lined with old photographs, black and white images of the mansion's previous owners. The Blackwood family, who had lived here for over a century before converting it into a care facility in the 1980s. The photos showed generations of stern-faced individuals, their eyes seeming to follow us as we walked. "Tell me about these cognitive fluctuations," I said. Pulling out my notebook, Mrs. Henderson paused beside a large window that overlooked the facility's garden. "It started about 6 months ago with Mrs. Chen, one of our Alzheimer's patients. She'd been with us for 3 years, couldn't remember her own daughter's name, barely spoke at all. Then one morning, she started speaking fluent French and recounting detailed memories of growing up in rural France during World War II. Had she ever lived in France? Born and raised in San Francisco's Chinatown. Never left California until she came here, but the memories were so specific, so detailed. She described the taste of bread made from chestnut flour during the occupation, the sound of German soldiers marching through her village, the hiding place where her family kept their radio. We continued walking, passing the common room where several residents sat in wheelchairs, some staring vacantly at a muted television, others engaged in quiet conversations with staff members. Then it spread. Mrs. Henderson continued. Mr. Rodriguez started having memories of serving in the Korean War, even though his military records show he was a conscientious objector who never left the country. Mrs. Patterson began speaking about her childhood in 1920s Chicago in perfect period appropriate slang despite being born in Seattle in 1940. How many residents are affected? Nearly all of them. 43 patients experiencing what we can only describe as borrowed memories. But here's the strangest part. The memories are always historically accurate. We've fact-checked everything we could. and the details always match historical records, sometimes down to minute particulars that wouldn't be available in standard history books. She led me to a small office that had been set up for my use, complete with a desk, chair, and electrical outlets for my equipment. Through the window, I could see more of the garden, where a few residents walked slowly along winding paths, accompanied by staff members. "I'd like to start by interviewing some of the affected patients," I said. "Can you arrange for me to speak?" "With Mrs. Chen, of course. But Dr. Vasquez, there's something else you should know. The borrowed memories aren't random. They all seem to be connected to traumatic or emotionally significant events. Deaths, wars, losses, moments of profound grief or fear. It's as if something is collecting these experiences." An hour later, I sat across from Mrs. Chen in the facility's small library, a cozy room lined with books and warmed by a fireplace that had probably been original to the mansion. Mrs. Chen was a frail woman in her 80s, with silver hair and eyes that seemed much sharper than her medical records suggested they should be. "Hello, Mrs. Chen," I said gently. "My name is Dr. Vasquez. I'm here to talk with you about some of the memories you've been experiencing." She looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, not confusion, as I'd expected, but something closer to wariness. "Which memories?" she asked in clear English. "Mine, or the ones that don't belong to me?" The question caught me off guard. Most dementia patients experiencing false memories couldn't distinguish between real and fabricated recollections, but Mrs. Chen seemed fully aware that something unusual was happening. "Let's start with the French memories," I said, setting up my digital recorder. "Can you tell me about those?" Mrs. Chen closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them again, her entire posture had changed. Her shoulders straightened, her chin lifted slightly, and when she spoke, it was with a faint accent I couldn't place. "The bread was terrible during the war," she said. "Mamang would mix sawdust with the flour to make it stretch, and we pretended it was delicious because complaining would have broken her heart. Papa listened to the BBC on the radio we kept hidden behind the loose stones in the cellar wall, and afterward, his face would look like he'd aged another year." The detail was extraordinary, but what struck me more was the emotion in her voice, genuine grief and nostalgia for experiences that weren't hers. "These memories feel real to you?" I asked. "More real than my own sometimes," she admitted, her posture relaxing back to its original state. "I can taste that sawdust bread, Dr. Vasquez. I can smell the fear in that cellar. But I know they're not mine because I remember my real childhood to playing in Chinatown, helping in my father's restaurant, speaking Cantonese with my grandmother." "Do you know whose memories they are?" Mrs. Chen was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fireplace. "There was a girl named Marie Dubois. She lived in a village called Oradour-Surveillance. The memories... They end on June 10th, 1944, when the SS came." I felt a chill run down my spine. Oradour-Surveillance had been the site of a Nazi massacre during World War II. The entire population had been killed, leaving no survivors to pass down such detailed personal memories. "How do you know her name?" "She told me," Mrs. Chen said simply. "In dreams at first. Then during the day, when I'm sitting quietly. She's still here, Dr. Vasquez. They all are. They all the people whose memories we're experiencing. They're trapped here somehow, trying to tell their stories through us." I spent the rest of the afternoon interviewing other residents, and each conversation deepened the mystery. Mr. Rodriguez described memories of fighting in the Battle of Chosin Reservoir, with details that matched classified military reports. Mrs. Patterson recounted the experience of dying in the 1918 flu pandemic with medical accuracy that shouldn't have been possible for someone born decades later. But most disturbing was what they all said about the source of these memories. The people whose experiences they were reliving were still present in some way, existing as conscious entities within the facility as evening approached. I decided to explore the building more thoroughly. Mrs. Henderson had given me access to the historical records, and I spent several hours in the basement archives, reading through documents related to the mansion's past. The Blackwood family had owned the property for 4 generations, and their history was marked by tragedy. The original owner, Cornelius Blackwood, had lost his wife and 3 children to scarlet fever in 1889. His son, Marcus, had been killed in World War I, leaving behind a widow who died by suicide in 1925. Marcus's son, David, had succumbed to the 1918 flu pandemic, and David's daughter, Helen, had lived alone in the mansion until her death in 1982. But it was Helen Blackwood's personal papers that provided the most disturbing information. Her journals, written in an increasingly erratic hand over the span of decades, described her growing obsession with contacting the dead. She'd apparently spent the last 30 years of her life conducting seances and experiments in what she called psychic archaeology, attempting to capture and preserve the memories of deceased individuals. The final entry in her journal, dated just a week before her death, read, "The veil grows thinner with each passing year. I can feel them gathering, all the lost souls whose stories were never told, whose memories died with them. Soon, I'll have enough spiritual energy concentrated in this place to create a permanent nexus between the world of the living and the realm of forgotten experiences. Death will no longer mean the end of memory." I looked up from the journal, suddenly aware of how quiet the basement had become. The heating system had stopped running, and even the usual sounds of the building settling seemed to have ceased. In the silence, I could swear I heard something else, whispered voices speaking in languages I couldn't identify, telling stories to no one. My hands were shaking as I photographed Helen's journal entries with my phone. The implications were staggering. If Helen had somehow succeeded in creating a supernatural nexus that attracted the memories of the dead, then the residents of Riverside Manor weren't experiencing false memories at all. They were serving as living vessels for the consciousness of people who had died without anyone to remember them. I was so absorbed in the journal that I didn't notice the temperature dropping until my breath began to mist in the air. The basement was suddenly freezing, far colder than any mechanical system could have made it. And in the growing cold, the whispered voices were becoming clearer. I could make out individual words, now fragments of stories being told in dozens of different languages and accents. A child's voice recounting the night her family fled the Irish potato famine. An elderly man describing the moment he realized he was dying alone in a tenement fire. A woman speaking in what sounded like Yiddish, telling of hiding from pogroms in Eastern Europe. They were all stories of death, loss, and trauma, exactly the kinds of memories the residents upstairs had been experiencing. I grabbed Helen's journal and headed for the stairs, but as I reached the door, it slammed shut with tremendous force. I tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The whispered voices grew louder, more insistent, and I realized they were trying to tell me something important through the cacophony of different languages and accents. One voice began to dominate a woman speaking in clear, educated English. "Dr. Vasquez," the voice said, and I felt ice form in my veins as I recognized it. "Helen Blackwood, Please don't be afraid. You're dead, I whispered, my breath visible in the frigid air. Yes, but death is not the end of consciousness, merely its transformation. I've spent 40 years in this place, learning the true nature of memory and experience. What you call borrowed memories are actually fragments of human consciousness that never found rest. The temperature continued to drop, and frost began forming on the walls. In the condensation on a nearby window, words began to appear as if written by an invisible finger. Every person who dies with unfinished business, with stories untold, with trauma unprocessed, their consciousness seeks a vessel through which to finally find peace. That's why you chose this place, I said, understanding beginning to dawn. A memory care facility where the barriers between different states of consciousness are already weakened. Precisely. Dementia and Alzheimer's damage the brain's ability to distinguish between self and other, between present and past, between real and imagined memories. It creates ideal conditions for displaced consciousness to find temporary hosts. More words appeared on the window, but something has gone wrong. The residents were supposed to experience each memory once, allowing the displaced consciousness to find peace and move on. Instead, the memories are being trapped here, creating a growing accumulation of traumatic experiences. Why can't they move on? The voices in the basement grew more agitated, and I heard what sounded like sobbing, screaming, and wailing in a dozen different languages. The temperature plummeted further, and ice began forming on my clothes. Because someone else is here, Helen's voice said, now tinged with fear. Someone who feeds on traumatic memories, who grows stronger with each story of loss and pain. I thought I was creating a sanctuary for forgotten consciousness, but I've trapped them with a predator. The lights went out, plunging me into absolute darkness. In the blackness, I could hear something moving, not the whispered voices of the displaced dead, but something else, something that breathed with a sound like wind through autumn leaves. Who? I asked, though part of me already suspected the answer. Cornelius, Helen whispered, her voice barely audible now. The original owner of this house. He lost everything, wife, children, hope. The grief transformed him into something that exists only to consume the pain of others. He's been feeding on the memories I've attracted here, growing stronger with each tragic story. The breathing sound grew closer, and I could smell something like old earth and decaying flowers. In the darkness, I saw 2 points of light that might have been eyes, hovering at about human height, but wrong, somehow too bright, too cold, moving in ways that defied normal anatomy. Dr. Vasquez, a new voice said, deep and resonant with unnatural authority. How kind of you to join our collection. The eyes moved closer, and I could make out a vague shape in the darkness door, draped in what looked like formal Victorian clothing, but insubstantial, as if made of shadow and mist. Cornelius Blackwood, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Indeed. And you are the expert in anomalous memory phenomena. How perfectly fitting that you should become part of my archive of human suffering. I felt a presence pressing against my mind, trying to access my memories, searching for experiences of loss and trauma to add to its collection. Images flashed through my consciousness. My grandfather's death when I was 7, the car accident that had nearly killed my sister, the patients I'd been unable to help over the years. But then I realized something important. The displaced consciousness Helen had attracted weren't just random fragments of memory, they were people who had died with unfinished business, with stories they needed to tell. And right now, they needed Someone to help them tell those stories one final time. I pulled out my digital recorder and turned it on, the small LED light providing a tiny point of illumination in the darkness. "I'm listening," I called out to the whispered voices around me. "Tell me your stories, all of them." The effect was immediate. The whispers grew stronger, more coherent, and I began to distinguish individual voices. Marie Dubois spoke of her last moments in occupied France, of her love for a boy named Pierre who would join the resistance, of her hope that someone would remember their village after the war. James O'Malley described fleeing Ireland during the famine, carrying his dying daughter across an ocean to a new world where she would never see her first birthday. Sarah Goldman recounted hiding in a cellar in Kiev, listening to her neighbors being dragged away by Cossacks, wondering if her children had escaped to America as planned. Each story was a life cut short, a narrative left incomplete, a human experience that had never found an audience. And as I listened, recording each account, something extraordinary began to happen. The voices grew calmer, more peaceful, and one by one they began to fade, away, not disappearing, but finding the rest they had sought for so long. "No, Cornelius," roared, his shadow form writhing in fury. "You're ruining everything. Those memories belong to me." But he was growing weaker as each displaced consciousness found peace and moved on. The traumatic experiences he had been feeding on were being transformed into completed stories, their pain processed and released rather than consumed. Helen's voice returned, stronger now. "Thank you, Dr. Vasquez. This is what I should have done from the beginning, given them a voice instead of trying to preserve them." The temperature began to rise, and the oppressive presence that had filled the basement started to dissipate. Cornelius's shadow form was becoming more transparent, his grip on the physical world weakening as his source of nourishment disappeared. "This isn't over," he hissed, his voice fading like static on a radio. "There are other places where the forgotten dead gather, other opportunities to feed on human suffering. I will find them." Then he was gone, leaving only the gradual return of warmth and the sound of the building's heating system clicking back on. The door to the basement opened easily now, and I climbed the stairs back to the main floor, my recorder heavy with the weight of dozens of completed stories. In the common room, I found several residents sitting peacefully, their expressions calm and centered in a way that seemed different from when I'd arrived. Mrs. Chen looked up at me as I passed, and I saw recognition in her eyes, not confusion or displacement, but clear awareness of who and where she was. "They're at peace now," she said softly. The voices have stopped. Over the following days, I documented the remarkable transformation at Riverside Manor. The residents' borrowed memories had faded, replaced by a gradual return of their own recollections. While they still struggled with the effects of their various conditions, the supernatural confusion had completely disappeared. Mrs. Henderson was amazed by the change. "It's like having our residents back," she told me. "They're still dealing with memory loss, but it's their own memories they're working with now, not these foreign experiences." I spent weeks transcribing and researching the stories I'd recorded in the basement, verifying historical details and tracking down surviving family members of the displaced dead. Marie Dubois had indeed lived in Oradour-sur-Viroise and died in the massacre. James O'Malley's passenger records showed him arriving in New York with a sick child who died shortly after. Sarah Goldman's family had fled Ukraine during the early 20th century pogroms. Each story was real. Each voice had belonged to an actual person whose experiences had been lost to time and death. by giving them an audience, by allowing them to complete their narratives. I had somehow enabled them to find peace. But Cornelius's final words haunted me. There were other places where forgotten consciousness gathered, other opportunities for entities like him to feed on unprocessed trauma. And if Helen Blackwood had been right about the nature of memory and consciousness, there might be more facilities like Riverside Manor experiencing similar phenomena. I began researching reports of unusual cognitive symptoms at other memory care facilities around the country. The patterns were subtle but consistent, residents suddenly displaying knowledge they couldn't have acquired, speaking in languages they'd never learned, experiencing vivid memories of historical events they'd never witnessed. My phone rang as I was reviewing a particularly intriguing case from a facility in Maine. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number. Dr. Vasquez. The voice belonged to an elderly man, shaky with age but urgent with purpose. My name is Dr. Robert Kimmel. I'm the medical director at Sunset Ridge Memory Care in Bangor. We've been following your work and we need your help. What's the nature of the problem? Our residents have been experiencing what we can only describe as collective nightmares. They're all dreaming about the same event: a ship sinking in icy water, people drowning, calls for help that go unanswered. But here's the strange part. The dreams are historically accurate down to the smallest detail. I felt a familiar chill of recognition. What ship? The Titanic. Dr. Vasquez. Our patients are experiencing the memories of passengers who died in the disaster. But unlike typical false memories, these are complete. Our residents can describe the exact temperature of the water, the names of crew members, conversations that took place in the lifeboats. I looked out my office window at the Portland skyline, thinking of all the untold stories that might be seeking voices, all the forgotten dead who had never found peace. Cornelius had been right about one thing. There were other places where traumatic memories gathered, other opportunities for both healing and predation. I'll be there tomorrow, I told Dr. Kimmel, as I packed my equipment for another investigation. I thought about what Helen Blackwood had discovered in her decades of research. Death was not the end of consciousness, merely its transformation. And in a world where so many people died with their stories untold, their trauma unprocessed, their experiences unwitnessed, there would always be displaced consciousness seeking vessels through which to find completion. My work at Riverside Manor had been just the beginning. There were more forgotten voices waiting to be heard, more stories that needed telling, more souls seeking the peace that comes only when someone finally listens. And somewhere in the spaces between memory and consciousness, between the living and the dead, entities like Cornelius waited to feed on unfinished business and unprocessed pain. But now I understood something he didn't: traumatic memories lose their power when they become complete stories. Pain fades when it finds an audience, and the dead find peace when the living give them a voice. I turned off the lights in my office and headed home to prepare for the journey to Maine, where new voices were waiting to tell their stories of a cold April night in 1912, when the unsinkable ship met the ice, and 1,500 souls found themselves with stories that would never be told until now. The work of listening had only just begun.